Right, so now we've set up our still life and we are going to set about drawing the still life. So keeping in mind that this art piece is not primarily a pencil drawing, it's actually going to be a chancy watercolor drawing with a bit of line that comes in later. So the first lesson is going to be about drawing the still life, just getting the shapes onto the piece of paper, getting the basic proportions down, the overlaps, and creating the basic artwork. The idea is not that the learners spend hours getting it perfect. The idea is that they get an impression of the still life. They get the main lines of the still life. Just be careful because some of them will start to shade it. Just a few of them will start to do that. So you just need to explain that it's going to be made into a watercolor. Also, I'm going to suggest that you just use HB pencil. You don't want the pencil to be too dark so you actually see all the pencil lines through the watercolor. I would also like to suggest that the learners make a viewfinder. So a viewfinder is just two corners of a piece of paper. It doesn't have to be rounded like this, can be square. And the viewfinder can create a landscape shape or a portrait shape. And these shapes can then be looked through at the still life, and the learners can get a basic idea of what can fit into a landscape shaped piece of paper or a portrait shaped piece of paper. So viewfinders are actually very useful because when starting out, learners find it quite tricky to actually figure out what they can fit onto their paper and what they can't. So that's the viewfinder. And when you are working with these ages, let's say 12 to 14, around about 13, you get all aptitudes. You get those learners that already can draw quite proficiently, a few of them, and you get some that have no idea and feel very insecure and vulnerable. So the aptitudes really range. It's the same as the way teenagers grow. You get some tiny ones and some tall ones, and again, like that, the aptitudes are different, although they don't necessarily go with the height of the child. So what I'm going to suggest, just to help the learners overcome their fear of drawing, is to first have a look at the still life and then using their finger, so just imagine you are the still life, using their finger, they can then draw around the shapes and the objects of the still life to get an idea of the different shapes. Then they can use their finger and they can draw the shapes onto the piece of paper with their finger. So they get some kind of idea of what is going to fit in onto the paper. And it's not scary because they're not making any marks yet. I would then suggest, if you have a scrap piece of paper that's the same size, or a spare piece of paper that's the same size, I would suggest that they take a pencil and they have 5 minutes to sketch, quickly sketch the whole still life on the piece of paper, and encourage them to use, let's say, 80% of the paper. So in other words, you're going to find some of them that are going to be doing tiny little things because they're afraid in the middle of the paper. So you need to encourage them to use the whole paper as much as possible. And in making the sketch, they let go of this kind of freeze that they have relating to drawing, and they kind of get a little bit loosened up. You can even get them to loosen up their arms and loosen up their hands and get a little bit loose. So the first sketch will get rid of that tenseness. Then they can go into drawing the art piece and the main shapes. So you are going to point out the larger shapes at the back, the middle shapes, the smaller shapes, and you are going to basically help them to see what is there, help them to see overlaps, help them to see proportions, help them to see what is big and what is small, help them to see the light source, where is the light coming from, help them to see the shadows. Now your drawing is going to be a lot lighter than the one I'm going to show you. I just did this darker for the purposes of this video. So here I've drawn my still life. This is an adult drawing. It is more complicated than the learners need to do. It just serves as an inspiration for the learners. And again, they're going to be doing it lighter than this. Now, for weeks 5 and 6, I'm just bringing in this now quickly. We are going to be taking the same drawing and working with that. So what I want to suggest is once the learners have done their drawing, that they actually trace a second one. Just hold it against the light and trace a second one that they put aside and use in weeks 5 and 6. So that's the next step. They're going to get drawing, and you as teachers are going to encourage the learners to keep it loose, keep it fun. Don't get too tight or perfectionistic. Remember that nature is perfectly imperfect. That means they don't have to be perfect. It'll lose its life if they are. So help them just to let go a little bit.